I found 14 smartphones in a den beneath a fallen oak in the Huron-Manistee National Forest. All of them had final recordings. And what I saw on those screens still keeps me up at night. October 2019, the Michigan DNR hired me to investigate 14 disappearances experienced hikers who vanished over 18 months, all carrying phones that went dark simultaneously. I'm a wildlife forensics contractor, former Army tracker. I've spent 15 years analyzing predator kills. I thought I'd seen everything. I was wrong. The phones were arranged on flat stones, deliberately placed, screens cracked, casings punctured, but 11 still powered on. The footage showed twilight pursuits through dense forest, people running, cameras capturing something massive and upright moving through trees, and in 3 recordings, clear frames of a creature 7 to 8 feet tall with a wolf-like head and amber eyes that looked directly at the phones like it understood what they were. When I tried to report it, my contract was terminated within hours. Federal non-disclosure agreement, threats of prosecution. But I kept copies of the footage, because some truths are bigger than legal agreements. What happens when the thing collecting our devices decides it's done hiding? My name is Vernon Hollins, and I need to tell you about something I found in the Huron-Manistee National Forest in the fall of 2019. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just asking you to listen, because what happened up there in Michigan changed the way I understand the world. And if you spend any time in deep woods, especially in the Midwest, you need to know what might be out there watching you. I've been doing wildlife forensics work for about 15 years now, ever since I left the Army. Before that, I spent 8 years as a tracker and reconnaissance specialist, mostly in Afghanistan and Iraq, reading terrain and following signs that most people would walk right past. When I got out, I figured I'd put those skills to use somewhere quieter. Turned out state agencies and private land managers needed people who could analyze predator behavior, document kill sites, and figure out what happened when livestock went missing or hunters didn't come home. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest, and it keeps me in the field where I belong. I live alone in a cabin outside Bloomington, Indiana. Divorced, no kids, and that's probably for the best given how much time I spend in places most people wouldn't camp overnight. I like the solitude. Always have. But solitude and isolation are 2 different things, and what I walked into in Michigan was isolation of a kind I'd never experienced before. The email came on a Tuesday in late October, encrypted, which was unusual but not unheard of for government contracts. Michigan Department of Natural Resources, marked urgent. The subject line just said, "Consultation request confidential." I almost deleted it, thinking it was phishing, but something made me open it. The case summary was brief. 14 missing persons over the previous 18 months, all within a 12-mile corridor of the Huron-Manistee National Forest. All experienced hikers, all carrying smartphones that should have pinged cell towers but went dark simultaneously the moment they vanished. No bodies recovered, no blood, no torn clothing. No physical evidence of any kind except for the fact that they were gone. What got my attention was the pay double my usual contract rate, which meant someone was either desperate or wanted this handled quietly. Probably both. And there was something else that bothered me. 14 people vanishing from the same stretch of forest over 18 months should have been national news, but I'd never heard about it. Not even a mention in the outdoor recreation forums I check sometimes. That kind of media silence doesn't happen by accident. I read through the victim. Profiles they'd attached. Ages ranged from 22 to 59. Men and women. Solo hikers. Couples. One group of 3 friends on a weekend camping trip. No obvious connection between them, except they'd all chosen trails in that same narrow corridor, and they'd all disappeared between dusk and dawn. The reports mentioned search and rescue operations, cadaver dogs, helicopter flyovers, volunteer searchers combing the woods for weeks. Nothing. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole. I should probably mention that I don't believe in supernatural explanations. I've seen too much to think the world needs ghosts or monsters to be dangerous. People get lost, animals kill. Weather turns. Terrain betrays. I figured this was a serial offender, maybe someone with military or hunting experience who knew how to cover his tracks, or a poaching operation gone wrong, disposing of witnesses. Something explainable, even if it was ugly. I sent back a 1-line response. "When do you need me?" They replied. "Within an hour, with coordinates, a contact name, and a start date, 3 days out." I spent those 3 days checking my gear, reviewing topographic maps of the area, and telling myself this was just another job. I loaded my truck on Friday morning tactical pack, evidence collection kit, GPS unit, camera equipment, cold weather gear, and started the 7-hour drive north. The weather forecast called for early season storms rolling in off Lake Michigan, temperatures dropping into the 30s at night. I crossed the state line just after noon, watching the landscape shift from flat farmland to rolling hills and then to dense forest as I pushed deeper into Michigan's interior. By the time I reached Cadillac, the sky had turned the color of old bruises and the wind was picking up. I checked into a motel off Highway 131, third-floor room with a view of the parking lot, and tried to sleep. I couldn't. Something about the case felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate yet, like walking into a room where someone just stopped talking. I kept thinking about those 14 phones going dark at the same moment their owners vanished. That's not how people get lost. That's how they get taken. The Michigan Department of Natural Resources field office in Cadillac sits at the edge of town, a low brick building that looks like it was built sometime in the 70s and hasn't been updated since. I arrived just after 8 on Saturday morning, the sky threatening rain and the temperature hovering around 40 degrees. A few trucks were parked in the lot, all of them government plates, all of them showing the kind of wear that comes from actual field work rather than administrative cruising. Inside, the office had that generic government smell: old coffee, copy machine, toner, and the faint mustiness of files that haven't been digitized yet. A woman at the front desk checked my ID, made a phone call, and told me to wait. I stood there, looking at the bulletin board while she typed something into her computer. Missing person flyers, hunting regulation updates, a reminder about chronic wasting disease in the deer population. Normal stuff. Nothing about 14 people vanishing from the forest. 5 minutes later, a man came through the security door and introduced himself as Garrett Voss, field supervisor. He was maybe 50, 55, with the kind of weathered face you get from spending decades outdoors and the tired eyes of someone who isn't sleeping well. He shook my hand without smiling and gestured for me to follow him. We walked down a corridor lined with filing cabinets to a conference room at the back of the building. He closed the door behind us and spread a stack of materials across the table: topographic maps marked with colored pins, search and rescue reports bound in manila folders, and a USB drive in a small evidence bag. "Everything you need is here," Garrett said. He didn't sit down. "Victim. Profiles are on the drive. Maps show the last known locations and search radiuses. You've got 1 week to produce findings." I looked at the maps. The colored pins formed a rough cluster around 3 trailheads within a 12-mile stretch of forest, all of them along the northeast section of the Huron-Manistee. Dense, old-growth timber, ravines, seasonal hunting areas, minimal cellular coverage, the kind of terrain where you could walk 20 minutes off-trail and feel like you're the only person left in the world. "Search and rescue found nothing?" I asked. "Nothing," Garrett said. "Dogs tracked scents to certain areas, then stopped. No alerts, no signs of remains. Just stopped." He lit a cigarette, even though there was a no smoking sign on the wall behind him. "We've had volunteer searchers, helicopter flyovers, ground-penetrating radar in some sections. Came up empty every time." I studied the victim profiles. 14 faces looking back at me from printouts, driver's event, license photos, mostly. A few pulled from social media. All of them looked healthy, capable, the kind of people who knew how to handle themselves outdoors. One was a biology professor from Ann Arbor. Another was a retired Marine who'd done 2 tours in Iraq. A 26-year-old trail runner training for an ultramarathon. These weren't careless tourists who wandered off path and got turned around. "What about the phones?" I asked. The brief mentioned they all went dark simultaneously. Garrett's jaw tightened. "That's classified information. You weren't supposed to see that detail." But I did see it. And it's the only thing about this case that doesn't fit a standard predator pattern or even a human offender. He took a long drag on his cigarette and stared at me like he was deciding something. Finally, he said, "The phones stopped transmitting at the exact moment each person vanished. Not gradually, like they wandered into a dead zone. Not damaged, like they dropped them. During an attack. Just off. All at once. Every single one." That made the back of my neck prickle. "That's not natural." "No," Garrett agreed. "It's not. Which is why you're here. We need someone who can look at this from a wildlife forensics angle and give us anything we can put in an official report. Families are pushing hard for answers. Lawmakers are starting to ask questions. And we've got hunting season starting in 3 weeks. If we don't close this, or at least provide some explanation, we're going to have a PR nightmare. He handed me a set of keys and a laminated access pass. These'll get you through the restricted forestry roads. You've got 1 week. Stick to physical evidence. No speculation, no wild theories. And for God's sake, don't talk to the press. I took the keys. What are you expecting me to find? Garrett crushed out his cigarette in a coffee mug on the table. Honestly, I don't know. But whatever it is, I need it documented properly so we can move forward. The official line is, "These are open investigations with no evidence of foul play. I need you to either confirm that or give me something concrete to work with." He left without saying goodbye. I sat there for another 10 minutes reviewing the materials, making notes, trying to see a pattern. The disappearances weren't random, they clustered around specific trailheads and specific times. Dusk to dawn, always alone or in small groups, always in the same 12-mile corridor. I loaded everything into my truck and drove out to the forest. The rain started just as I turned onto the access road, a cold October drizzle that made the trees look black against the gray sky. I passed a wooden sign that read, "Huron-Manistee National Forest, dispersed camping permitted," and kept driving until the pavement turned to gravel and then to dirt. The trailhead parking area was empty. I pulled in, killed the engine, and sat there listening to the rain drum on the roof. Through the windshield, I could see the trail disappearing into the trees, white pines and hardwoods still holding on to their leaves, underbrush thick enough to hide anything that didn't want to be seen. I checked my gear one more time, loaded a fresh battery into my GPS unit, and stepped out into the rain. The forest smelled like wet earth and decay, that rich autumn smell of things breaking down and returning to soil. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find something that would make me question everything I thought I understood about predators, intelligence, and what's possible in the deep woods where nobody's watching. The forest was quieter than any place I'd ever been, and I've spent time in some remote areas. Afghanistan had its silent moments, high-altitude valleys where the wind died and you could hear your own heartbeat, but this was different. This wasn't the absence of noise. This was the presence of silence, if that makes sense. Like the forest was holding its breath. I set up base camp about a quarter mile from the central trailhead, in a small clearing that gave me good sight lines in 3 directions. The victim profiles showed 5 disappearances from this immediate area, more than the other 2 trailheads combined. If there was a pattern to find, it would start here. The landscape was dense, old-growth timber white pines that had to be 100 feet tall, mixed with hardwoods still clinging to their autumn leaves. The underbrush was thick enough that you couldn't see more than 20 or 30 feet in most directions, and the ground was uneven, full of ravines and deadfall from past storms. Good terrain for ambush, if you were a predator. Terrible terrain for search and rescue. I spent the first afternoon walking the marked trails with my GPS unit, photographing anything that seemed off and taking notes in my field book. At first, I found nothing. No blood, no torn clothing, no obvious signs of struggle. The trails were well-maintained, clearly marked, exactly what you'd expect in a national forest that sees regular recreational use. But as the light started to fade, maybe 4:30, 5 o'clock, I began noticing smaller details that didn't fit. Scratch marks on certain trees at shoulder height, deep gouges in the bark, running vertically like something had reached up and dragged its claws downward. I measured them. The marks started about 5.5 feet off the ground and extended another 1.5 feet higher, too high for a black bear standing upright, too deep, too. These weren't casual marks from a bear sharpening its claws. These were deliberate, forceful, like territorial marking. I photographed each one, noting the GPS coordinates and the direction the tree faced. After documenting 6 trees with similar marks, I started seeing a pattern. They formed a rough perimeter around the central trail system, like boundary markers. Then there was the smell. Faint at first, just an acrid edge to the air in low-lying areas near the creek beds. But as I moved deeper into the forest, it got stronger. Wet fur, decay, and something sharper that reminded me of ammonia. Not constant, it came and went depending on wind direction and terrain, but when I caught it full strength, it made my eyes water. I had 2 cadaver dogs with me, borrowed from a local SAR unit, trained animals, experienced in wilderness work. But when we reached the area where the smell was strongest, both dogs stopped. Not alerting, not tracking, just stopped. They planted their feet and refused to move forward, hackles up, whining low in their throats. I've seen dogs react to predator scent before, but this was different. This was fear. I didn't push them. Whatever they were sensing, I trusted their instincts more than my own curiosity. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was setting and the temperature had dropped into the mid-30s. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and made ask notes while I still had daylight. The scratch marks, the smell, the dog's reaction. Individually, none of it was conclusive. Together, it suggested something large, territorial, and present in these woods recently enough that its scent was still triggering alarm responses in trained animals. I ate a cold meal, didn't want to cook anything that would spread food smells, and settled in to wait for dark. The forest sounds were normal at first. Wind in the pines, a few crows calling in the distance, the creek running over rocks about 50 yards north of my position. Then around 2 in the morning, I heard the vocalizations. They started distant, maybe half a mile out. My first thought was, coyotes, we have them in Indiana, and their calls can be unsettling if you're not used to them. But these were wrong. The rhythm was off. Coyotes yip and howl in a chaotic chorus. These sounds were more controlled, almost conversational. A low vocalization, then a response, then another. Response from a different direction. Back and forth. Deliberate. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening, trying to count distinct voices. 3, maybe 4. But the spacing and timing suggested coordination, like they were communicating specific information rather than just making noise. The calls continued for maybe 20 minutes, moving in a wide circle around my camp, but never getting closer than a quarter mile. Then they stopped. Just cut off mid-sequence, and the silence rushed back in. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept thinking about the scratch marks and the way those dogs had refused to move forward, and I wondered what the hell I was actually looking for out here in the dark. The next 2 days, I expanded my search radius using a borrowed tracking dog named Rex, a German Shepherd, with 8 years of SAR experience. His handler, a volunteer named Phil, stayed with me for the first morning, but had to leave for work by noon. He left Rex with me, along with his emergency contact number and a reminder to keep the dog on lead at all times. Rex picked up a scent trail almost immediately, leading me off the marked paths and into dense thicket heading northeast. We moved slowly, me photographing and marking the route with GPS waypoints, while Rex worked the ground with his nose down, tail straight out, every muscle focused on the track. The terrain got rougher deadfall everywhere, thorny undergrowth catching at my pants, ravines cutting across our path every 100 yards or so. We descended into one of those ravines about 2 hours in, and that's when the smell hit me again. Not faint this time. Strong enough that I had to breathe through my mouth. Wet fur. Decay. That sharp ammonia burn that made my sinuses ache. Rex stopped at the bottom of the ravine, sniffing the air, and I saw his body language change. Not fear exactly, but extreme caution. He moved forward another 20 feet and stopped again, staring at something I couldn't see, through the underbrush. I came up beside him and looked where he was looking. The ground ahead showed disturbances, depressions in the soft earth too large and deep for deer. I measured one, 18 inches long, 8 inches wide, pressed into the dirt with enough force that I could still see the outline clearly despite 2 days of weather since the last rain. Whatever made it was heavy. Beyond the depressions, I found a cleared area, maybe 15 feet across. The vegetation had been stripped away, not grazed, stripped. Small saplings broken off at chest height, the breaks showing scoring that looked like teeth marks. Larger branches dragged aside and arranged in what might have been deliberate piles, though I couldn't be sure. I spent an hour documenting everything. Photos from multiple angles, measurements, soil samples, sealed in evidence bags. My field notes filled 3 pages. But the whole time I was working, I felt watched. It's hard to explain if you haven't experienced it, not paranoia, not imagination. A physical sensation of attention, like standing in front of a security camera but not knowing where it's mounted. Rex felt it too. He kept looking over his shoulder, ears rotating, tracking sounds I couldn't hear. On the 3rd afternoon, day 4 of my contract, I took Rex deeper into the ravine system, following what looked like a game trail that wound through the densest part of the forest. The musk smell was constant here, layered into everything. We were maybe 3 miles from the nearest trailhead, in terrain so thick that even with GPS, I'd have trouble navigating out after dark. That's when Rex stopped cold. Not gradually, just froze mid-step, staring at a wall of underbrush about 30 feet ahead. His whole body went rigid. The whining started low in his chest, rising in pitch until it was almost a whimper. I'd never heard him make that sound before. I looked where he was looking and saw nothing, just dense vegetation, shadows, the late afternoon light filtering through in broken shafts, but Rex wouldn't move. I tried verbal commands, gentle pressure on the lead, even treats for my pack. He planted his feet and pulled backward, desperate to retreat. That's when I felt it too. Not a sound or a smell, a presence. The weight of something large and aware watching us from inside that wall of brush. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it breathing or moving. But every instinct I developed over 8 years in combat and 15 years tracking predators told me we were being evaluated by something that could close the distance between us faster than I could react. I made the decision quickly. Backed Rex up slowly, keeping my eyes on that wall of brush, one hand on the Glock at my hip even though I didn't draw it. We retreated maybe 50 yards before I felt the pressure lift. Rex relaxed slightly, though he kept looking back over his shoulder the whole way out of the ravine. We made it. Back to camp just as the light was failing. I fed Rex, checked him over for injuries, nothing, just stress, and sat by the fire trying to process what had happened. Or more accurately, what hadn't happened. We'd been allowed to leave. I was certain of that. Whatever was in that brush could have pursued us, and we'd never have made it out. But it let us go. The question was why. I returned Rex to his handler the next morning and told Phil I'd found some interesting tracks, but nothing conclusive. He didn't ask questions, which I appreciated. The look on my face probably told him enough. I spent that night reviewing my documentation photos, GPS waypoints, field notes, trying to make sense of the pattern. The scratch marks formed a perimeter. The cleared areas suggested territorial behavior. The depressions in the earth were too large for any known predator in Michigan. And that moment in the ravine, when Rex froze and something watched us from the underbrush, that wasn't imagination. That was real. The next morning, day 5 of my contract, I went back alone. I know that sounds stupid, and maybe it was, but I needed to follow the trajectory Rex had been tracking before he panicked. If something was living in that ravine system, I needed to find where. I moved carefully, following the GPS coordinates from the previous day, paying attention to every detail. The forest felt different at dawn, less oppressive, more neutral, like it was reserving judgment. I carried my Glock on my hip where I could reach it quickly, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against something that size. The musk smell led me deeper into the ravine, stronger with every 100 yards. I was maybe half a mile past where Rex had stopped when I saw the fallen oak. Massive tree, probably dead for decades, its root system forming a natural cavity where the trunk had pulled free from the earth. The kind of formation that creates sheltered dark, concealed, protected from weather and sight lines. The ground around it was compacted and worn smooth, not from deer or bear activity, from repeated use by something heavy enough to pack the earth down hard. I circled the perimeter slowly, photographing everything, and noticed branches arranged near the entrance, not randomly fallen. Placed. Deliberate camouflage that would make the opening nearly invisible from 20 feet away. The smell was overwhelming here. That wet fur, decay, ammonia combination that made my eyes water and my stomach turn. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and mouth and approached the entrance. Claw marks gouged into the exposed wood of the root system. Deep furrows, 4 parallel lines, spaced like fingers but larger. I measured them with my field tape, 7 inches from first mark to fourth. The wood was torn, not scratched. These marks came from something applying serious force. I should have called Garrett then. Should have documented the site and waited for backup. But I was 5 days into a 1-week contract, and I'd found something that might actually explain 14 disappearances. I couldn't walk away without knowing what was inside. I clicked on my headlamp and crawled into the den. The cavity was larger than it looked from outside, maybe 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide at the back. The ceiling was low, I had to crouch, but the space was clearly being used as shelter. The musk was so strong it was almost physical, coating the back of my throat. I breathed through my mouth and swept my headlamp around slowly. That's when I saw the phones. 14 of them, arranged on flat stones in a rough semicircle near the back wall. Some face up, screens cracked but visible. Others stacked on top of each other. All of them showing damage, punctured casings, bite-like indentations, scratches across the glass. But they were arranged, not scattered, not destroyed and discarded. Arranged deliberately, like someone had taken time to position them. My hands started shaking. I'd seen cache behavior in predators before: leopards storing kills in trees, wolves burying food, but this was different. These weren't food items. These were objects the victims had been carrying, objects that had value to humans but no practical use to an animal, unless the animal understood what they meant. I photographed everything in place, using my camera's timestamp function to document the exact time and GPS coordinates. Then I violated direct protocol and started bagging the devices as evidence. I knew Garrett had told me not to remove anything without authorization, but I also knew these phones might contain recordings or data that could explain what happened to their owners. The whole time I was working, I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was stealing from something that would notice and care. I moved quickly, sealing each phone in a separate evidence bag, labeling them with the position I'd found them in. 11 of the 14 still showed some battery indicator when I pressed the power button. The other 3 were dead or too damaged to power on. I backed out of the den as quickly as I could without disturbing anything else, my heart hammering in my chest. Outside, in the gray morning light, I could breathe again. I looked around at the forest, at the trees and shadows, and felt the weight of attention again, watching, evaluating. I didn't run. Running triggers chase instinct in predators, and whatever claimed this den was a predator. I walked back to camp at a steady pace, constantly aware of my surroundings, expecting at any moment to hear footfalls behind me or see movement in my peripheral vision. Nothing came, but I absolutely knew that I'd crossed a line. I'd taken something from a place I didn't belong, and there would be consequences for that. Back at camp, I packed everything into my truck and drove straight out of the forest. I didn't stop until I reached a motel 30 miles away in a town called Manton. I got a room on the 3rd floor, backed my truck into a space where I could see it from the window, and locked myself inside. Then I spread the 14 phones across the bed and started charging the ones that still had battery response. My hands were still shaking. I kept thinking about those phones arranged on stones in the dark, and what it meant that something had collected them deliberately, what it meant that something understood what humans valued enough to keep those objects after killing their owners. I need to tell you about what I found on those phones. I've thought about keeping this part to myself, but if anyone else is going to walk into those woods, they deserve to know what happened to the people who didn't come back. The motel room in Manton was basic bed, desk, small bathroom, view of the parking lot. I spread all 14 phones across the bedspread and started with the ones that still had charge. 11 were functional enough to power on. The other 3 were too damaged or completely dead. I organized them by timestamp, oldest to newest, and started my review with the first victim, March 26, 2018. A man named Todd Brennan, 34 years old according to the victim profile Garrett had given me. Recreational trail runner, experienced outdoorsman. The kind of person who should have known better than to be on the trails after dark. His phone had 43% battery when I powered it on. The last video file was time-stamped 6:27 p.m., right around sunset that time of year. I plugged in my headphones and pressed play. The footage started stable. Todd was jogging, holding the phone at chest height, probably using a fitness app to track his run. The audio was mostly his breathing and footfalls on packed dirt. Forest on both sides, the light already fading to that gray twilight color. He was moving at a good pace, nothing panicked yet. Then, at the 1-minute mark, he slowed, stopped. The camera swung around as he looked behind him, breathing harder now, but not from exertion. The forest behind him looked empty, dark trees, shadows, nothing moving. But I could hear it in his breathing. He'd sensed something wrong. He turned back and started running, not jogging anymore, running. The camera bounced wildly, catching fragments, trail, trees, sky, his own ragged breathing getting louder. At 2 minutes, 10 seconds, he tried to dial 911. I watched his thumb hit the emergency call button. The screen showed connecting for 3 seconds, then call failed, no service. He was still running. The camera work got shakier, like he was losing coordination. At 3 minutes 40 seconds, I heard it. A low snarl, close enough that the phone's microphone picked it up clearly. Not a bear, not a wolf, something else. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up even in a motel room 30 miles away. Todd stumbled. The camera caught a glimpse of something massive and upright, moving through the trees to his right, parallel to his path. Too fast, too big. The footage jerked as he fell, the camera landing face up on the trail, showing darkening sky through the tree canopy. His breathing was audible for another 5 seconds, panicked, desperate. Then a shadow crossed the frame, blotting out the sky, and the recording cut to black. I sat there staring at the dead screen for a full minute before I could move. Then I watched it again, and again, 3 times through, taking notes, trying to maintain analytical distance, the speed of pursuit, the deliberate stalking pattern whatever chased Todd had paced him, paralleling his route before moving in, the unnatural silence before the attack. No warning growls, no territorial vocalizations, just efficient predation. I moved to the next phone. Different victim, same pattern. A woman hiking alone at dusk, her footage showing pursuit through dense forest, heavy breathing. The moment she realized she wasn't going to make it out. Her recording ended with a low vocalization that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard, almost questioning, like it was curious about the device she was holding. Phone 3. A couple camping overnight. Their footage was longer, more detailed. They'd heard something circling their tent after dark, had turned on their phone camera when the scratching started on the nylon. The audio picked up breathing outside, deliberate and measured, like something testing their defenses. Then, silence. Then a ripping sound as claws tore through fabric, and screaming, and the phone dropping and going black. I went through 7 recordings that first night, each one a variation on the same horror. People who realized too late they were being hunted. Their final moments preserved in high-definition clarity. Some ran, some tried to hide. One man, a Marine veteran according to his profile, tried to fight. His footage showed him picking up a heavy branch, standing his ground, shouting challenges into the darkness. His recording lasted the longest, almost 8 minutes, before something grabbed him and the camera flew from his hand. By midnight, I'd filled 6 pages with notes. Behavioral patterns, attack strategies, response times from initial awareness to final contact. I was trying to stay clinical, professional, treating this like any other predator analysis, but my hands were shaking and I'd stopped being able to eat hours ago. These weren't just kill recordings. These were evidence that something intelligent was hunting humans in the Huron-Manistee National Forest. Something that understood pursuit, understood ambush, understood that humans carried devices that mattered to them, and I'd taken those devices from its den. The second night of reviewing recordings, I started noticing patterns that disturbed me more than the violence itself. These weren't random attacks. They were methodical, strategic, and in some cases, the creature seemed to be doing something I couldn't explain with standard predator behavior. Several victims had attempted to call for help. Every single one failed, the same way signal lost mid-dial, even in areas where the topographic maps showed cell coverage. That suggested either equipment failure across multiple carriers and phone models, which was statistically impossible, or something was actively interfering with the signals. I didn't have an explanation for how that would work, but the pattern was undeniable. Then there were the recordings where victims spoke directly to their cameras, documenting what was happening like they knew the footage might be found. A 52-year-old schoolteacher from Lansing, hiking alone, described hearing footsteps pacing her for over an hour before sunset. She stayed calm, kept walking, explained to the camera that she was heading back to the trailhead. Her voice was steady, professional, like she was narrating a nature documentary. Then the footsteps got closer, and her narration stopped. The recording continued for another 3 minutes, audio-only breathing, movement through brush, and then those vocalizations. I isolated that audio file and played it through my noise-canceling headphones. What I heard made my skin crawl. Low guttural sounds, yes, but with inflection. Rising tones like questions. Pauses like it was waiting for response. Then the wet sounds I didn't want to think about. And silence. The botanist, Claire, had the clearest audio evidence. Her recording was time-stamped June 14, 2018, around 7:30 p.m. She'd been conducting plant surveys off-trail, moving through dense forest with her phone camera active to document specimens. The footage showed ferns, moss-covered logs, evening light filtering through the canopy, normal field research documentation. Then at the 9-minute mark, she stopped moving. "Do you hear that?" she said to herself. Or maybe to the camera. The audio picked up vocalizations in the distance. She described them as like speech, but not human, almost conversational. She was a scientist, trained to observe and document, and that training held even as she realized something was wrong. She started moving faster, still filming, the camera bouncing. The vocalizations got closer. At 12 minutes, she stopped and turned the camera on herself. Her face was calm, but her eyes showed fear. "If anyone finds this," she said, "there's something in the Huron Manistee that isn't in any field guide. It's been following me for at least 20 minutes. It's trying to communicate, I think. The sounds have structure, pattern." The camera jerked as something grabbed it or grabbed her hand holding it. The last visual was a blur of forest and sky. Then the phone hit the ground face down, but the audio continued. Claire's voice no longer calm, saying, "No, no, please." And then those vocalizations, again, closer now, directly, over the phone. Deep rumbling sounds that shifted in tone, almost like syllables, like it was responding to her, asking something, or maybe answering. Then the wet tearing sounds, then silence. The recording ran for another 43 seconds, showing nothing but darkness and forest floor debris before the file ended. I played that section 15 times, trying to understand what I was hearing. The creature wasn't just killing, it was vocalizing before, during, and after, testing sounds, experimenting, like it was learning or trying to understand something about its prey. I'd spent years studying predator behavior: wolves, bears, mountain lions, even human predators in combat zones. I knew what hunting looked like. This was different. This showed curiosity, intent, something approaching intelligence. By 3 a.m., I'd reviewed 11 recordings and filled 10 pages with notes. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept the lights on in the motel room and checked the locks on the raid door twice. I was 30 miles from the forest and still felt exposed, like distance meant nothing to whatever had made those sounds. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat there, with the phone spread across the bed, staring at the final evidence of 14 people who'd walked into the woods and never came back. And I absolutely knew that I was holding something no one was supposed to see. 3 of the recordings contained clear visual evidence, not glimpses or shadows. Full-frame captures of the creature in motion, close enough that my wildlife identification training should have told me exactly what I was looking at. Instead, it told me nothing, because what I saw didn't fit any known species. The first clear footage came from a phone belonging to a 28-year-old geology student doing field research. He'd been documenting rock formations near a creek bed, his phone mounted on a small tripod for stable footage. The creature entered the frame at the 6-minute mark, moving through shallow water about 20 feet from the camera. 7 to 8 feet tall, standing fully upright. Bipedal locomotion, not the hunched shuffle of a bear on its hind legs. The posture was wrong for any known animal: shoulders too broad, arms too long, movement too fluid and controlled. It was covered in dark, matted fur with visible patches of scarring on the limbs and torso. Old injuries, healed over. Evidence of a long life in rough terrain. But it was the head that made me pause the footage and stare. Distinctly canid structure, elongated muzzle, pointed ears set high on the skull, but the proportions were off. Too large, too heavy. And when it turned toward the camera, the eyes caught the late afternoon light and reflected back amber yellow, like a dog or wolf, but with an unmistakable awareness. It wasn't just seeing the camera, it was looking at it, studying it. I watched that 10-second sequence frame by frame. The creature's hands, and they were hands, not paws, showed opposable digit structure. It reached down and picked up something from the creek bed, held it up to examine it, then dropped it and continued moving. That simple action, that examination and decision, that was tool use cognition. That was problem-solving behavior. The recording continued for another 2 minutes. The geology student must have been hiding nearby, watching, because his breathing was audible on the audio track, rapid, panicked, trying to stay quiet. The creature moved out of frame. 30 seconds of silence. Then movement again as the creature re-entered from the opposite side, moving in a search pattern. Methodical. Systematic. Hunting something it knew was present but couldn't see. The recording cut off abruptly. I checked the file metadata. No corrupted data, just ended. Like the phone had been damaged or destroyed deliberately. The second clear footage was even more disturbing. A couple in their 40s, camping overnight, had set on their phone to record video inside their tent as a security measure. The footage showed the tent interior, their sleeping bags, camping gear. Timestamp read 2:17 a.m. Everything was still. Then, at the 40-minute mark, a shadow moved across the tent wall, large, bipedal, moving slowly around the perimeter. The audio picked up breathing outside the nylon, deep, measured. The kind of breathing that comes with conscious control, not exertion. Then scratching sounds, deliberate and exploratory, like it was testing the fabric's strength. The couple woke up. You could hear their whispered panic, see movement in the sleeping bags as they huddled together. The scratching stopped. 10 seconds of silence. Then a tearing sound as claws ripped through the tent wall like tissue paper. The camera caught a brief glimpse, dark fur, massive shoulder, that elongated muzzle before the phone was knocked aside. The screaming lasted 15 seconds. Then wet sounds. Then silence. The recording continued for another 6 minutes, showing nothing but the torn tent wall and forest beyond, before the battery died. The third recording was the one that changed everything. The creature looked directly into the camera. Not past it, not at the person holding it, at the device itself. Like it understood what phones were, like it knew humans valued them. A 36-year-old hiker, running, filming over his shoulder, trying to document his pursuit. The camera work was chaotic but captured the creature in motion, covering ground impossibly fast, moving through dense forest like the underbrush wasn't there. Then, at the 2-minute mark, the hiker tripped, fell. The phone landed face up on the trail. The creature approached, stepped into frame, stood there looking down at the phone, head tilted, ears forward, curious. It reached down with one hand. I could see the fingers clearly, the opposable digit structure, the scarred knuckles, and almost touched the screen. Then, it paused, looked up directly into the camera lens, and its eyes caught the LED flash. Those amber-yellow eyes held the camera's gaze for 3 full seconds. Aware, intelligent, evaluating. Then it lunged forward and the recording ended. I sat there in that motel room staring at the frozen final frame, and I understood something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't a mindless predator. This was something that understood tools, understood that humans carried devices, maybe even understood that those devices recorded information. It collected the phones deliberately, kept them, studied them, and I'd taken them from its den. I spent the next day compiling my report. I knew it would probably be my last act as a contractor for the Michigan DNR, but I had to document what I'd found. Professional obligation aside, 14 families deserved answers, even if they'd never get the full truth. I kept the language clinical, avoided sensational terms, wrote unidentified bipedal, predator instead of what I was actually thinking. Documented the behavioral patterns, tool recognition, cache behavior, strategic hunting, possible communication attempts. I included timestamps, GPS coordinates extracted from the phone's metadata, and frame-by-frame analysis of the visual evidence. The report ran 23 pages with footnotes and appendices. I knew it was explosive. Even sanitized, the implications were undeniable. Something intelligent was living in those woods. Something that hunted humans. Something that understood what phones were and kept them like trophies or research specimens. I made encrypted copies of everything, burned the footage onto 3 separate drives and hid them in different locations. Uploaded compressed files to a secure cloud server under a dummy account. Then I called Garrett and requested a meeting. Neutral location, I said. A diner in Cadillac, public enough that nothing would happen there. He agreed without hesitation, which should have been my first warning sign. I arrived at the diner 20 minutes early, took a booth in the back with clear sight lines to the entrance and exits, had a secure drive in my jacket pocket containing copies of the most compelling footage. When Garrett walked in at exactly 2 p.m., he wasn't alone. 2 men in civilian clothes followed him, took a table near the front. Federal. I guessed from their bearing and the way they positioned themselves to watch both me and the door. Garrett slid into the booth across from me, didn't order coffee, didn't make small talk, just looked at me with tired eyes and said, "What did you find?" I laid out the basics. The den, the phones, the recordings. I kept my voice low and factual, explained the behavioral patterns, the evidence of intelligence, the impossibility of explaining it away as known wildlife. I slid the secure drive across the table. There's footage on here that you need to see. Clear visual documentation. This isn't a bear. Or a wolf. This is something else. Garrett didn't touch the drive. Play me one clip. I pulled out my laptop, loaded the file of the creature standing over the phone, looking directly at the camera, turned the screen so he could see, watched his face as the footage played. He didn't react. Didn't flinch when the creature's eyes caught the LED light. Didn't show surprise when those articulated fingers reached toward the screen. He just watched. And when it ended, he closed the laptop. "This is inconclusive," he said. I stared at him. "Inconclusive. The footage is degraded. Could be a bear. Could be someone in a costume. Either way, it doesn't constitute evidence of an unknown species. There are 14 recordings," I said. "Multiple angles, multiple victims, consistent physical descriptions. This isn't one blurry video from a distance. This is documented predation by something that exhibits. The phones will be reclassified as scattered by scavengers." Garrett interrupted. "Your findings are unsuitable for official record. Your contract is terminated effective immediately." He pulled a manila envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. "Your final payment. There's also a non-disclosure agreement that you'll sign before you leave. The material you've collected is now classified. Sharing it in any form with media, researchers, or private citizens will result in federal prosecution. Do you understand?" I understood perfectly. This wasn't a surprise. This was a shutdown. Fast, thorough, and backed by federal authority. The two men at the front table were making sure I understood the consequences. "You knew," I said quietly. "Before you hired me, you knew what was out there." Garrett lit a cigarette, even though the diner had a no-smoking policy. His hands shook slightly. "Sign the agreement. Take your money. Go home, Vernon, and don't come back here." He stood up, left the envelope on the table, and walked out with the choir, 2 federal agents following. I sat there alone, staring at the manila envelope, understanding that I'd just touched something much larger than a wildlife investigation, something that had been suppressed for years, maybe decades, something that people at levels far above the Michigan DNR wanted kept quiet. I signed the agreement, took the check, and walked out of the diner knowing that everything I'd found would officially never exist. But I kept the encrypted files, and I kept the coordinates of that den, because some truths are bigger than non-disclosure agreements, even if you never get to tell them. I drove back to the motel in Manton, checked out, and sat in my truck in the parking lot trying to decide what to do next. The smart move was to drive home to Indiana, deposit the check, and forget everything I'd seen, put it in the same mental box where I kept other things from my Army service that didn't have explanations. Move on, take different contracts, stay away from the Midwest. But I couldn't. Something about those phones arranged on stones in the dark kept pulling at me. The deliberate placement, the careful collection, the intelligence that implied. I'd spent 15 years tracking predators, and I'd never seen anything like it. This wasn't instinct. This was behavior that suggested awareness, curiosity, maybe even culture. I made the decision quickly, before I could talk myself out of it. I'd go back to the den one more time, document it properly, see if anything had changed in the 3 days since I'd taken the phones. Tell myself it was for closure, even though I knew it was something else. A need to stand in that place again and understand, even briefly, what I was dealing with. I drove to a 24-hour copy center in Cadillac and burned the files onto multiple physical drives. Uploaded everything to a secure cloud server with military-grade encryption. Then I called a colleague I trusted from my Army days, a former intelligence analyst named Ray who lived in Colorado. Told him I was sending him a sealed envelope. If anything happened to me, if I didn't check in within 48 hours, he should open it and decide what to do with the contents. "Are you in trouble?" Ray asked. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "But I found something in Michigan that people want kept quiet, and I need insurance." Ray agreed without asking more questions. That's the thing about certain friendships. You don't have to explain. You just have to trust. I mailed the envelope from a post office in Traverse City, then drove back toward the forest. It was late afternoon by then, the sky turning that gray color that precedes storms, temperature dropping. The weather forecast called for rain overnight and into the next day. Not ideal conditions for hiking alone into remote terrain, but maybe better. Less chance of running into other people, less chance of being followed. I parked at the same trailhead I'd used before and sat there watching the light fade. This was stupid. I knew it was stupid. Going back to the den alone, after taking the phones, after exposing the cache, That was the kind of decision that gets people killed in wilderness situations. But I couldn't let it go. Not yet. I packed light. GPS unit, camera, voice recorder, flashlight, sidearm. Left most of my gear in the truck. I wasn't planning to stay long, just hike in at first light, document the den's current state, confirm whether the creature had returned or relocated, and hike back out. 3 hours, maybe 4. In and out before noon. I spent the night in the truck, dozing in fragments, watching the parking area for any sign I'd been followed. Nothing. Just forest and darkness and the occasional passing car on the highway a quarter-mile away. At 5 a.m., with false dawn just starting to lighten the eastern sky, I locked the truck and started hiking. The forest felt different. Emptier. Like the usual wildlife had withdrawn from this area. I didn't see any birds, didn't hear the normal morning sounds, no squirrels, no rustling in the underbrush, just my footsteps on the trail and the wind in the pines overhead. I reached the ravine system around 6:30. The musk smell was fainter now, less concentrated. I moved carefully, following the GPS coordinates to the fallen oak. When I got there, my stomach dropped. The den had been abandoned. Not recently, this had happened days ago. Maybe right after I'd taken the phones. The stones where the phones had been arranged were scattered. The ground showed fresh disturbances, drag marks leading northwest deeper into federal land. The branches that had concealed the entrance were torn aside, not deliberately placed anymore, but cast away like the creature had left in a hurry. I photographed everything, taking measurements, documenting the trajectory of the drag marks. They led into terrain that even forestry crews avoided: steep ravines, thick deadfall, areas without trails or roads. I followed for maybe a quarter-mile, camera in hand, until the marks disappeared into a creek bed where the current had erased all physical sign. I stood there at the water's edge, looking upstream into dense forest, and felt that sensation again. Watched. Evaluated. Something was out there in the trees, staying just beyond sight, and it knew I'd come back. Knew I'd taken something that belonged to it. I didn't run, but I turned around and started walking back toward the trail at a steady, controlled pace, every nerve in my body screaming that I'd crossed a line I shouldn't have crossed and that there would be consequences for it. The walk back to the trailhead took 40 minutes, and every single one of them felt wrong. The forest had changed. I don't mean the physical landscape, I mean the atmosphere, the feeling of the place. It felt hostile in a way it hadn't before, like I'd violated something, and the woods themselves were rejecting my presence. I kept noticing small details that hadn't been there on my way in. Broken branches at irregular heights, not from weather or animals, but fresh breaks positioned like markers. Cleared sight lines through areas that had been dense underbrush 3 days ago. The vegetation had been stripped away deliberately, creating corridors where something could move parallel to the trail without being seen, but with clear views of anyone walking the path. I wasn't imagining it. This was territorial modification, strategic alteration of terrain for tactical advantage. I'd seen similar patterns in Afghanistan when we'd track insurgents who knew the mountains better than we did. They'd modify their environment subtly, creating advantages that wouldn't be obvious to outsiders, but that gave them complete control of their territory. The sensation of being watched intensified, not constant, but in waves. I'd walk 50 yards feeling alone, then suddenly that pressure would return, the weight of attention, the certainty that something large and aware was pacing me just beyond the tree line. I kept my hand near the Glock, but didn't draw it. Drawing a weapon triggers escalation, and I didn't want to escalate. I just wanted out. Twice, I heard vocalizations. Low, resonant, uncomfortably close. Not the conversational sounds from the recordings. These were different, shorter, more purposeful. Like communication between observers, like something was tracking my progress and reporting it to others. The sounds came from different directions, once from my left, once from behind me, suggesting coordination. I didn't speed up, didn't run. Running triggers chase instinct in predators, and whatever was out there was absolutely a predator. I maintained a steady pace, kept my breathing controlled, and focused on navigation. The GPS showed I was 3/4 of a mile from the trailhead. 20 minutes if I kept moving. The forest went silent. Not gradually, all at once. The wind stopped. The distant crow calls ceased. Even the creek I'd crossed earlier seemed to quiet. That absolute silence, that means something apex has entered the area and everything else has gone still to avoid notice. I kept walking, focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Counted steps to keep my mind occupied. At 200 steps, I'd be at the clearing. At 300, I'd see the trailhead. At 350, I'd reach my truck. 212. 213. The trees thinned ahead. I could see daylight. 220. The trail widened. 235. The parking area came into view. My truck sat alone, undisturbed, exactly where I'd left it. 240. I stepped out of the tree line into open space. The pressure lifted immediately. That watched feeling disappeared like someone had flipped a switch. I turned and looked back at the forest. Saw nothing. No movement. No eyes watching from the shadows. But I knew something had. Paced me all the way out, had evaluated whether to stop me, and had decided for reasons I'd never understand to let me leave. I walked to my truck, forcing myself not to run. When I reached the driver's side door, I found the scratches. Deep gouges in the metal, fresh and deliberate, running from the door handle down to the wheel well. 4 parallel marks. 7 inches from first to fourth. The same spacing I'd measured on the trees near the den. A message. A warning. Or maybe a promise. I photographed the damage with shaking hands, then got in the truck and locked the doors. Started the engine, and drove out of there without looking back, my hands gripping the wheel hard enough that my knuckles went white, and stayed that way until I hit the highway. I drove straight through to Indiana. 11 hours with only 2 stops for gas and coffee. I couldn't stay in Michigan another night, couldn't sleep in a motel knowing what was out there in those woods. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those scratches on my truck door and understood how close I'd come to not leaving at all. I reached my cabin outside Bloomington around 10 p.m. Locked every door and window. Checked them twice. Turned on every exterior light I had. It was irrational. I was hundreds of miles from the Huron Manistee, and whatever lived there wasn't going to track me across state lines. But rational thought and survival instinct are different things, and my instincts were screaming that I'd brought something home with me, not physically, but the knowledge of it, the awareness, the certainty that the wilderness wasn't empty. I didn't sleep that night, just sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, reviewing the footage again, trying to understand what I'd documented, trying to reconcile what I'd seen with everything I knew about wildlife behavior and predator psychology. The creature showed complex cognition, problem solving, tool recognition, strategic thinking, communication capacity, territorial awareness, and something else, something that bothered me more than the violence. It showed restraint. It had let me leave the den that first time, had let Rex and me retreat from the ravine, had paced me to the trailhead but stopped at the tree line. It could have killed me multiple times and chose not to. That suggested calculation. Decision-making based on factors I couldn't identify. Maybe it recognized that killing a human who was documenting evidence would trigger a larger response. Maybe it understood that letting me leave with the phones would result in exactly what happened, a cover-up that kept its existence officially denied. Or maybe it just wasn't hungry and I'd gotten lucky. I spent the next 3 days obsessively researching similar encounters. Cryptid sighting databases, indigenous legends, academic papers on bipedal locomotion and canids, historical accounts of unexplained predation. Most of it was noise hoaxes, misidentifications, campfire stories. But buried in the noise were patterns, sightings clustered in remote forest corridors across the Midwest and northern states. Encounters that described similar physical characteristics, vocalizations that witnesses called almost like speech, disappearances in national forests that never got explained. And in several cases, the accounts mentioned phones or cameras being found damaged but not destroyed, kept, collected. On the 4th day, I contacted someone I'd heard about through wilderness research circles, a retired fish and wildlife biologist named Walter Chen who'd worked the Great Lakes region during the 80s and 90s. He was in his 70s now, living in Minnesota, officially retired but still consulting occasionally. I reached him by phone and asked carefully if he'd ever encountered reports of unusual predation patterns in northern forests. Large bipedal animals, strategic hunting behavior, the kind of thing that wouldn't fit official wildlife categories. There was a long pause. Then he said, "This conversation is off the record." Understood. "Where are you calling from?" "Indiana. But I was recently working in Michigan, Huron Manistee National Forest." Another pause. Then, "Did someone from DNR hire you?" "Yes." "And then shut you down the moment you found something they couldn't explain away?" "Yes," Walter sighed. "You're not the first. This has been documented for decades. Always suppressed. Always classified. Because acknowledgement would trigger public panic and destabilize hunting, tourism, federal land management. The economic impact alone would be devastating. So the official position is that these things don't exist, and anyone who finds evidence gets exactly what you got paid off and silenced. How many? I asked. How many of these things are out there? I don't know, no one does. But if I had to guess, based on sighting clusters and territory size, I'd say maybe a few dozen across the northern, Midwest, maybe more. Operating in remote corridors where human traffic is minimal and they can avoid prolonged exposure. They're smart enough to stay hidden, patient enough to wait us out. And they've been there longer than we have. He gave me 2 pieces of advice before we hung up. First, honor the NDA, because the people enforcing it had resources I couldn't fight. Second, if I ever went back into deep forest alone, especially in the Midwest, watch for territorial markers and trust my instincts when something felt wrong. Because these things understood humans now. They'd learned our patterns, and they were always watching. I thanked him and ended the call. Sat there in my cabin, understanding that I'd touched the edge of something much larger than 14 disappearances in Michigan. Something systemic, something that had been carefully managed and suppressed across multiple agencies in decades, and there was nothing I could do about it except keep the files hidden and stay away from those woods. Months passed. I kept working, but I turned down every contract in the Midwest. Stayed South Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas. Predator analysis, poaching investigations, the usual work. Nothing involving unexplained disappearances. Nothing in deep forest corridors where cell service disappeared and people vanished without trace. I kept the encrypted files secure, never shared them. The NDA wasn't just legal threat, it was survival instinct. Walter had been right about the resources behind the cover-up. These weren't just state agencies protecting tourism revenue. This was coordinated suppression across federal land management, wildlife services, probably higher. The kind of thing where asking too many questions got you labeled unstable or worse. But I couldn't stop researching. Late nights in my cabin, going through databases, cross-referencing sighting reports with disappearance patterns. The more I looked, the more I found. Minnesota had a cluster, Wisconsin, northern Indiana, which made my stomach turn because that was close, upper Michigan Peninsula, all remote corridors, all areas with indigenous legends about creatures that walked upright and hunted humans. I started receiving emails, anonymous, sent from disposable addresses, blurred photos of tracks in snow, 14-inch prints, bipedal stride pattern, audio files of vocalizations recorded at night, GPS coordinates of territorial markers, scratch patterns on trees, cleared areas, den sites. People who'd seen something and recognized me somehow as someone who might believe them. Maybe my name had circulated in certain circles after the Michigan contract. Maybe there were more of us than I thought, people who'd touched this thing and survived and couldn't talk about it openly. I never responded. Just saved every message in an encrypted folder. Documentation for something, though I didn't know what. Maybe just proof that I wasn't crazy, that what I'd seen in the Huron-Manistee was real and ongoing, and happening in more places than anyone wanted to admit. I stopped sleeping well, started keeping lights on at night, checked my property perimeter every morning for signs of disturbance. I was hundreds of miles from that forest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been marked somehow. That taking those phones had created a connection I couldn't break. The creature knew humans carried devices now, knew we documented things, knew we valued that documentation enough to risk our lives retrieving it. What happened when something that intelligent decided to test those boundaries, when it stopped avoiding humans and started seeking them out? I didn't have answers, just questions that kept me awake, and a growing certainty that what I'd found in Michigan was only the beginning of something much larger. A year passed, then another. I kept working, but the contracts felt hollow now, like I was going through motions. Analyzing bear kills when I knew there were things in the woods that made bears look like prey, writing reports about poaching when I'd seen evidence of predation that would rewrite everything we understood about North American megafauna. The anonymous emails continued, maybe one every few weeks. Different senders, same pattern, people encountering something they couldn't explain in remote forests and reaching out to someone they thought might understand. I read every one, saved every one, never responded because I didn't know what to say. That wouldn't sound like confirmation of things. I'd signed legal documents denying some of the messages were detailed. A hunting guide in Minnesota describing a client who disappeared from a tree stand overnight, 20 feet off the ground, with scratch marks on the trunk that went higher than any bear could reach. A park ranger in Wisconsin finding phones arranged on rocks near a creek bed, exactly like the pattern I'd documented, and being told by his supervisors to log them as scattered by flooding. A SAR volunteer in the Upper Peninsula tracking drag marks into terrain so remote they had to call off the search. And hearing vocalizations at night that made his dogs refuse to continue. Others were brief, just coordinates and a single line. Found something you should see. I never went. Couldn't. The NDA was one thing, but more than that, I'd learned my lesson in Michigan. Some knowledge has weight. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed. I thought about those phones often. 14 of them, arranged on stones in the dark. The creature had kept them after the kills, studied them maybe, understood that humans valued these objects enough to hold them, even while dying. What did that mean about its intelligence, its curiosity, its relationship to us? Sometimes I wondered if letting me leave had been strategic, if it had wanted me to find those phones. Wanted someone to document what was happening in those woods, even if that documentation would be suppressed. Maybe it understood that human authorities were hiding its existence. And maybe this thought disturbed me most. It wanted that to change. I stopped taking wilderness contracts entirely. Moved to consulting work I could do from home, data analysis, report writing, training seminars, safe work. Work that kept me away from deep forests and the things that lived there beyond human awareness. I kept checking my perimeter, though. Kept watching the tree line at dusk. Kept listening for vocalizations in the night that would tell me something had followed me home after all. Nothing came. The forest had let me leave, and apparently, that was final. But I never stopped feeling watched. Never stopped understanding that the wilderness wasn't empty. It was occupied by things that had learned us, studied us, adapted to our patterns and our presence, and they were still out there, waiting, watching, patient in ways we'd never be. I'm telling you this now because you need someone else to know. The encrypted files are stored in 3 locations. If you're hearing this, I've given you access to one of them. What you do with that information is up to you. I've honored the NDA as much as my conscience allows, but some truths are bigger than legal agreements, and people deserve to know what's out there. I live differently now. I've accepted that my understanding of wilderness has fundamentally changed. The forests aren't empty spaces between cities. They're occupied territory. They belong to things that were there long before we started hiking trails and pitching tents and assuming we were alone. I think about those phones constantly. 14 devices arranged on flat stones in the dark, collected deliberately by something that understood what they meant to humans, even if it couldn't operate them. Trophies, maybe. Or curiosities. Or evidence of something we're not ready to acknowledge, that there are other intelligent species sharing this continent with us, and they've been watching us for generations. The creature in the Huron Manistee let me leave twice. Let Rex and me retreat from the ravine. Let me walk out after taking the phones. Why? I don't know. Maybe it calculated that killing me would trigger responses it wanted to avoid. Maybe it recognized something in me, another predator, another tracker, something that earned minimal respect. Or maybe it was just full and I got lucky. I'll never know. But I know this. If you're planning to hike deep forests alone, particularly in the Midwest, particularly in remote corridors where cell service disappears and trails peter out into old-growth timber, carry more than a phone, move in groups. Pay attention to territorial markers, scratch patterns on trees at shoulder height or higher, cleared sight lines where vegetation's been stripped away, areas where the normal forest sounds go silent all at once. And if you ever feel watched in a way that prickles your spine and makes your gut twist with instinctual fear, trust that feeling. Don't rationalize it. Don't tell yourself you're being paranoid. Turn around and leave immediately. Because that sensation isn't imagination. It's a survival response that's been bred into us over millions of years, and it's trying to tell you that something apex is nearby and you're in its territory. Some hunts are older than human memory. Some predators never stopped learning, never stopped adapting, never stopped watching us clear their forests and build our trails and walk through their territory like we own it. They're still out there, in the Huron Manistee, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, in the remote corners of every national forest where humans don't go regularly and the tree cover is thick enough to hide something 7 feet tall that moves faster than you can run. The phones proved they're collecting evidence now, learning about us. Maybe someday they'll stop avoiding exposure. Maybe they'll decide that hiding serves no purpose anymore. Maybe the next person who finds a cache of devices won't get the choice to leave. I keep my files locked and my secrets buried. I take contracts far from deep woods. And when I do go outside, even here in southern Indiana, even in familiar territory, I go during daylight only. Never alone. And never, ever, after dark. Because I've seen what's out there. I've stood in its den and taken its collection and felt its eyes on me from the shadows. I've heard its vocalizations and seen its intelligence in action. And I know with absolute certainty that we're not alone in these forests. We never were. The question isn't whether these things exist. The question is what happens when they decide to stop hiding. When they stop letting us leave. When the phones they've collected teach them enough about us that they change their strategy. I don't have answers. Just evidence no one will officially acknowledge. And a warning I know most people won't heed. Because humans are optimistic by nature. We assume the wilderness is ours. We assume we're safe. We're not. We've never been. And the things that live in the deep woods, the things that have watched us and learned us and collected our devices like trophies, they know it even if we don't. Stay out of the Huron-Manistee National Forest. Stay out of remote corridors in the northern Midwest. And if you don't, if you go anyway because you think I'm exaggerating or because you trust your experience more than my warning, at least carry something more than a phone. Because when those things come for you, a phone won't save you. It'll just be one more device arranged on stones in the dark, waiting for someone like me to find it and understand too late what it means. I still see those 14 phones when I close my eyes. Still hear Claire's voice describing vocalizations, like speech, but not human. Still feel that presence, watching from the brush as Rex whimpered and refused to move forward. And I know I was allowed to leave. That's what haunts me most. Not what I saw, but what chose to let me go. What calculated that I was more useful alive, documenting and warning, than dead in a den somewhere with my phone added to the collection. I'll carry that knowledge until I die. And maybe that's the real consequence, not prosecution or professional ruin, but living with the certainty that something out there knows me now, knows my face, my scent, my patterns. And if I ever go back into those woods, the choice to leave might not be mine anymore. So I don't go back. I stay away. I keep the files hidden. And I tell you this with the understanding that most people won't believe it, and the few who do probably won't change their behavior because of it. But maybe, just maybe, someone will listen. Someone will feel that prickle of recognition and turn around before it's too late. Someone will avoid becoming number 15. That's the best I can hope for now. That my testimony reaches someone who needs it. Someone who'll trust their instincts when the forest goes silent and the sense of being watched becomes overwhelming. Because those instincts exist for a reason. And the things that trigger them are still out there, in the deep woods, where the trails end and the trees grow thick and the darkness never fully lifts. Watching, waiting, patient, and learning.